Flesh and Blood has a reputation as an expensive game, and that reputation is well earned. If you're trying to play at the highest level with the best decks, you're going to be paying somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500 most of the time. But Flesh and Blood is also quite accessible on a budget, although you won't be able to play all the cards and you won't be able to play all of the heroes. Today, I want to talk about Assassin and how they fit in as a budget class. We are starting with Arachne, which in my opinion is probably the worst hero in the game to play on a budget. Arachne, as a hero, is fundamentally weak. When he plays cards with the keyword contract, he gets to look at the top card of his opponent's deck and then put it on the bottom if they want to. But turns out that effect doesn't actually do anything value-wise. Maybe if you're playing a long game plan, it might. And it allows them to easier hit contract targets, which are shown with Leave No Witnesses. Leave No Witnesses wants you to banish your opponent's red cards, and theoretically you could use Arachne's hero ability to find red cards on the top of your opponent's deck and get them in banish. Arachne's hero ability tends to be pretty blank, which means there's not really a reason to play them over the other assassins. Assassin also is uniquely bad as a budget class simply because they rely on really expensive cards. Obviously, Codex of Frailty is extremely expensive, costing you $90 a pop right now. This card is extremely strong. You will feel not having it in your deck, and oftentimes Assassin win rate is completely dependent on how many times they play Codex of Frailty in a game and how effective their Codex of Frailties are. Most of the cards in the Assassin deck are extremely expensive, and we can look at our pricing to check that. Both Leave No Witnesses and Codex of Frailty are extremely necessary for this deck to function, in my opinion, and Leave No Witnesses is $45 for a playset, and Codex of Frailty is almost $300 for a playset. So just right out of the gate, we're going to be spending way too much money to play this deck at a proper level. Without these cards, it's just not going to work. You can try and play Arachne without Codex of Frailty, but you just don't have powerful enough cards to be able to win against basically any deck. Surgical Extraction is also another very good contract card that Arachne might be able to use, but it's also quite expensive if you're a budget player. There's some other blues that Arachne would love to put in their deck, but they're pretty expensive from the new set. Persuasive Prognosis and Bonds of Agony. These cards aren't necessary for the deck and most of the time will act as just blue block 3s, so they can really be replaced and I don't think they're necessary. But that's pretty different from Codex of Frailty, Leave No Witnesses, and Surgical Extraction, which I think are very necessary for the deck. Another downside of Arachne is that they don't have any good cards in the chest slot. So that means that Tunic is actually significantly better than any of the alternatives. This is a deck that wants to play the long game, where Tunic is just so much better than Blossom of Spring, where I wouldn't even consider running Blossom of Spring, to be honest. One of the only good points about playing Arachne is that you actually want to play Mask of Perdition over any other headpiece, which means we get to save like $100 on our headpiece. And Coercive Tendency is actually a pretty strong blue card that's a spec that allows you to oftentimes be able to play out hands after your opponent has been disrupted. However, that disruption only comes in the form of Leave No Witnesses, Surgical Extraction, and Command and Conquer, which you aren't purchasing if you're a budget player. So you could attempt to play a fatigue style Arachne with no disruption, but it's gonna be really hard. Black-Tick Whispers are probably the best legendary feat in Arachne. They're not particularly expensive, about $20 to buy Black-Tick Whisperers, and I think that if you're a budget player and you're just super excited to play Arachne, I would probably recommend purchasing the Black-Tick Whispers and trying to make some sort of fatiguey tempo style build where you play a bunch of contract cards and try to get value out of rebuying your Black-Tick Whispers and Mask of Perdition. Overall, I just wouldn't recommend building Arachne as a budget player. New is the second assassin, and she is also Mystic, which grants her access to the Mystic card pool. New is one of the most disruptive heroes in the game, and she often gets to take cards in ways other decks do not. New benefits from being part of Part the Mistveil, which is a set that was heavily opened and has a bunch of cheap legendaries and majestics. Mask of Recurring Nightmare is the main mask that you would be wanting to play, and this card is extremely strong and it allows you to interact with your opponent heavily, even at fairly budget. This card is currently $14 as a rainbow foil, which means it's just so affordable. Just like Arachne, she is partially dependent on Codex of Frailty and Leave No Witnesses. However, I do think she can get away with not playing these cards if you're on a budget, just because the power level of her other cards is so high. Siren's Call as a card is one of just the most messed up cards of all time. It allows you to look at your opponent's hand and make a card block. And especially if your opponent is maybe trying to block out a dagger and then you make them block with another card and then draw a card on top of it, it's just so strong, and this card is just about $1. Bonds of Agony is also extremely strong in this deck. It allows you to interact with your opponent in ways that no other hero can, and it can stop a bunch of different combo decks. And if you play Bonds of Agony, a lot of times your opponent will just lay their hand on the table and say that they're not even going to try and interact with it. And Bonds of Agony is only $4 for one copy right now, so you can have a really strong game plan out of the gate with some fairly cheap staples of just playing some Chi, Siren's Call, Mask of Recurring Nightmare, and just some other value cards at common and rare without having to spend too much money. Persuasive Prognosis is another blue block 3 from Part the Mistveil, which is extremely strong in Nu's deck. She just gets to start banishing way more cards, and this card is a little bit more expensive, but if you're playing Nu, you probably want to pick it up. It's just way too strong, and it synergizes with her Chi and her mask. She can also do the assassin thing of playing Surgical Extraction, although Surgical Extraction is probably the weakest interaction in the deck. It's just so heavy on the card economy. So I do think you can get away with not playing it as a budget player and just find some blue block 3 in its place. Levels of Enlightenment is another card that does make your game plan much stronger. Playing a Levels and then playing a Chi card and then activating Nu's ability in response to the Levels grants you a lot of value, and Levels also really synergizes with her weapons, the Mistblade. I don't think Levels is necessary to experience Nu as a deck, so I think you can get away with not purchasing them until you've played the deck a bunch and are ready to go to the next level. Another great thing about Nu is that her arm and feet slots are taken up by common equipment, so you don't have to worry about purchasing legendaries in the arm and leg slot. The only thing is that she really wants to play Tunic, and she's trying to play a long game, which means that Blossom of Spring is really just out of the picture. Overall, I think Nu is actually a pretty good hero to play on a budget and start out with. You do lose a lot of power level, don't get me wrong, but you do get to play Nu, which I don't think is the case for Arachne. The third and final assassin is Uzuri. Uzuri is a hero that takes advantage of playing stealth cards in order to cause trickery with her opponent, and what her hero text basically means is that she gets to play with the knowledge as opposed to your opponent. When you play Flesh and Blood, most of the time, the defender has the advantage of knowledge. The defender gets to know what they're blocking before they block with cards. Uzuri flips that on its head. She gets to know what she's attacking with, but her opponent doesn't. So there is an element of surprise there that she really wants to take advantage of. The issue with Uzuri's hero power, though, is that it really takes advantage of these two cost attacks, including Command and Conquer. And obviously, Command and Conquer is not a budget card. We can't put that on in our budget deck. There are some other budget cards that we could definitely consider in that slot. So it's not totally lost here, but obviously we're not putting the weakest link in our deck either. Erase Face might be a little too expensive for you as a budget player, but even at rare, there are interactive cards you could be playing in order to stop your opponent from enacting their game plan. Cards like Humble, Cut Down to Size, those sorts of cards, they're definitely not as powerful as Command and Conquer, or the weakest link, or even Erase Face, but they can get the job done. The first card I want to talk about is Already Dead. This card's $20, and I think it's basically a scam. I would not purchase this card ever. I think it's awful and really it exists for very specific metas, so just don't buy this card ever. Uzuri is an assassin, so she relies on Leave No Witness and Codex of Frailty in order to play the game a lot of the time, and I think Uzuri is different from New in that she really does depend on the power of Codex of Frailty to take games. The main card to know in Uzuri is Shakedown. Shakedown allows her to play a stealth card, activate her hero power, and when this hits, she's just gonna take a card from your hand 90% of the time. This card's extremely strong, but it actually is not strong with Codex of Frailty, so there's some power in this deck outside of Codex of Frailty. Stealth card into Shakedown is just really strong, and it actually synergizes very well with some other cards. Bonds of Agony is one of those where you play Bonds of Agony, and sometimes you can fork your opponent. The fork works a little better with Command and Conquer, but because this is a stealth card, you can activate Uzuri's hero ability, or maybe you can play some other reactions. And the other reactions do tend to be a little cheaper from a money perspective. So maybe you could build a deck around playing Bonds and trying to do some other stuff with it. This card is actually pretty cheap, so you could try and figure out some sort of budget deck with that. And obviously Persuasive, it goes in this deck too. It's really strong, maybe it's too expensive, and its text is fine, but it's not as good as it is in New, and it is mostly just a blue block 3 stealth card, so you might be able to just get away with playing something else. Uzuri does not benefit from the Mistveil card pool, so she does have to play Legendary Feet and the Flick Knives. I think that Uzuri takes advantage of Flick Knives much better than the other assassins because she is able to flick a knife that gives -1 to the next D-React, which means that if she wants to, the next D-React will just block one less so that her on-hit will hit. Is this card completely necessary? No, but it is fairly cheap, $19. All the Outsiders legendaries are just pretty cheap, so you could think about purchasing this for the deck, even playing early. Overall, Uzuri is definitely not as good as New as a budget deck. I would probably stay away from Uzuri just because Leave No Witnesses and Codex of Frailty are going to be really necessary to your winning plan a lot of the time. So you probably want to stay away from this hero, but I think Shakedown's powerful enough that you might be able to get away with it.